Awesome. Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Hey, great. This party isn't over yet. Awesome. I hope everyone's been enjoying the summit. It's been really great experience for me. I'm Brett Tobert. I'm a senior threat intelligence analyst at NBC Universal. I'm happy to speak with y'all today about what I call Intellimation, or how to implement automation in your cyber threat intelligence program. So today we're going to review the state of the union, if you will, on threat intelligence and the threat landscape. Then we'll go into how you can start to add Intellimation to your business, discuss some drawbacks, and also think about future enhancements as well. So standard disclaimer, everything you hear about today is representative of my own experience and perspective and not that of my employer. Also, I've heard Olympic Destroyer be talked about a lot up here. I will not be covering that in our presentation today. So just a little bit more about me. I am local to the DMV. I hope everyone's been enjoying DC this week. Welcome. As mentioned earlier, I'm currently a senior analyst at NBC Universal. But prior to that, I've spent some time as a CTI analyst in the financial services sector. And I've also spent some time in the intelligence community supporting network defense operations. When I take off my analyst hat, normally I'm in the kitchen baking something or just eating. So I loved all the food themed presentations as well today. Um, Also, I love knitting for charity and playing Monster Hunter games. Lastly, this is a week of firsts for me. It's my first time speaking at a SANS summit, so be kind. Um, Thank you. Thank you. And I'm also kicking off my tenure, I guess, as an adjunct instructor at Bowie State University this week. So shout out to the Bulldogs. So getting into the threats, like let's just think back to last year really quickly. So we're in 2024 now, and the number of technology consumers and the number of threats far outweigh the number of cybersecurity practitioners. So thinking back to last year, 2023 saw massive increases in ransomware activity, the most well-known being Clop's widespread exploitation of a move it transfer vulnerability. There were also multiple entanglements between law enforcement and Maz and Raz operators. The FBI was duking it out with Quackbot and Black Cat, there and back again. And there was also sort of an increase in refine of how social engineering attacks are conducted. We saw new uses of malvertising, which is pretty interesting, and QR code phishing. And it's actually funny, one of my colleagues pointed out that all our badges have those QR codes. And it's like, oh, do I really want to engage with this? I don't know. On top of all of this, I think each week I'd get on LinkedIn and there'd be some think piece about the staggering cybersecurity skills shortage, job vacancies that need to be filled, and also surveys indicating those in the field may be not too happy with their roles due to the effects of mental and physical burnout. So organizations are now asking, how do we maximize our computational resources while supporting our people resources to maintain that work-life balance? And I think for threat intel professionals, this means needing to assess more and more information because more and more information is being produced, and quickly determining how or why this is of importance to an organization or to the broader threat landscape. And it's really difficult to do this when you have, finite time in the day, and to do this on a scalable and practical level. Here, automation can be really useful for making these assessments, and we'll go into some use cases around how to actually implement automation in your program so that's a bit more approachable. So the pyramid of pain, I had to like stifle a very maniacal laugh every time I heard someone mention the pyramid of pain over the past couple of days because I knew it was coming. Um, but for anyone unfamiliar, we use this model to describe how much you can annoy an adversary by denying certain TTPs and IOCs associated with its tooling and tradecraft. So in this case, hash values are nearly inconsequential, whereas TTPs are a bit more tried and true. Network defenders use this to help articulate detection and disruption opportunities as well. I think this concept is great, but I also think that there's a great opportunity to use this, but to apply it to the expectations and output of a cyber threat intelligence program, to articulate pain points. So using that same concept, we can sort of highlight what are the pain points of our organization and our CTI program. So instead of using the pyramid of pain to highlight adversarial tradecraft and opportunities to deny an adversary's use of that tradecraft or those IOCs, this pyramid highlights the expectations and workflows for a CTI program with respect to how time consuming it is, how manually intensive it is, and if there's an opportunity to scale that for automation. So in this example, there are just a handful of things that I think most CTI teams are probably responsible for. So at the bottom, we have curating known bad indicators. So taking indicators from published reports, vetting them, maybe curating them with some unique metadata as to answer why they're important for your organization, and then adding that to your tip. That's pretty straightforward. It's not too fussy. I will acknowledge that I approach that with a lot of bias because I think pivoting, going down to rabbit holes, digging into threat actor infrastructure is perhaps one of the funner things to do in CTI. Whereas something like producing finished intel is such a headache. You have to solicit your intel requirements, you have to do your research, craft hypotheses, craft alternating hypotheses, draft your findings, go through revisions, so forth and so on. However, most mature intel organizations likely all produce some form of finished intel, and you can't just stop doing that. I wish it was that simple. And unless your organization is postured to bring in 5 to 10 more analysts, which in this economy, shout out to you if you can do that, um, you have to find some ways to either offload some of your practices or just make them more efficient to perform. So here with this pyramid, you can focus on finding automation opportunities for the things towards the bottom so that you have a little bit more time to dig in for those more time consuming and manually intensive tasks. Or you can focus on trying to automate things towards the top so you can expand your subject matter expertise and dive deeper into some of those lighter tasks at the bottom. So it's an opportunity for you to ask yourself and your colleagues, what are our headaches? What are our bottlenecks? And what things can we try to make a little bit more efficient? So once you have that list of pain points, you can walk those through the traditional intelligence lifecycle. But instead of thinking about this from an intelligence lifecycle perspective, it's really helpful to use this as like a sort of new rendition of the agile methodology or the software development lifecycle. So in planning and direction, we'll use that to outline guardrails for whatever our solution may be. We want to establish risk parameters and acceptance parameters to dictate what the solution meant to address this pain point should actually look like and how we can achieve that. In collection, we want to use this a time to think about the tools and the people resources we need to actually build this solution. This is also a good time to communicate those needs to your upper leadership to get buy-in from them and support from them on how this solution can actually add some efficiencies to your team. In processing, this is where you sort of define maybe there's a current manual task or workflow that supports this automation. Document that to make sure your team understands that. So if the solution doesn't work or fails, that you have that manual task to fall back on. And you also want to develop a test environment or a development environment or data to before you can actually deploy your solution. Before going into analysis where you'll actually build your solution, I do want to caveat I'm being as like high level and generic as possible with the actual solution part because I don't want to sell anyone on any particular thing. You have to really think about what works best for your environment. That may be a series of Jupyter notebooks you expose to your team, Lambda functions, or different scripts you're deploying through GitHub Actions. But when I say develop a solution, that's what I'm referring to. Whatever that actual solution is that makes sense for your environment. So again, in analysis, this is where you're actually building out whatever that solution may be, even if it's just a drag and drop playbook in a SOAR product or a tip, and then get into dissemination and feedback. Feedback to me is really crucial for the traditional intelligence lifecycle. And here it plays a big role in Intellimation because you want to make sure that your solution is continuing to address your needs over time. And it may not work for the entire life cycle and the rest of your career. So it's important to have some indicators in place to measure how well that solution is performing and making sure that you actually go back and address those if it falls out of that sort of expectation for what you're building. All right. So we're going to pivot on from this, like, talking about theory and go into some specific examples focused on the threat actor Muddled Libra. So thinking back again to last year, there was so many threat actors sort of redefining different types of social engineering attacks. Muddled Libra was one of those groups that got in on that fun. They're well known for their reconnaissance and developing credential harvesting web pages using the Octopus phishing kit. They're typically meant to mimic an organization's SSO web page. This group is pretty crafty. We know now. Unit 42 put out some good reporting on them in June of last year, but we know now that they target way more than just outsourcing companies. They use their access to steal data and also sell network access to other cybercriminals. They'll also use their network access to conduct downstream attacks, targeting the victim's business partners or customers as well. So, like any new threat, when it first pops up on a cyber news feed, the ask to a CTI team is pretty standard. Leadership and technical teams, they want to know who this adversary is, how do they operate, is there any reason to believe that they may target us or a critical third-party supplier, and what opportunities exist to detect or deter the adversary's behaviors. So we're going to approach this from a tactical angle. So looking at the slide here, we can see an example smishing message that Muddled Libra sent to a target. Looking at this context, like one thing that'd be interesting to track for Muddled Libra, because we know they use that Octopus phishing kit and smishing, is identifying its initial access infrastructure. So how can we do that? It's pretty cool when you take a look into this. Octopus is pretty well known now, but if I didn't know anything about this threat, I would start by trying to evaluate the known bad IOCs that have been published, like this Cloudflare attack octa.com. Throwing those things in DNS dumpster, census, domain tools, iris, play around with the data again. And all of this sort of aligns with that bottom layer of our pyramid of pain points, which was curating known bad indicators. So moving on past like sort of playing around and analyzing the data, we're going to focus on the structure of that domain for the time being. So we see Cloudflare attack Okta. It contains a target name, a hyphen, and then normally with the Octopus phishing kit, there's one of several reusable key terms that the threat actor uses, like SSO, VPN, or Corp. In this case, it's Okta. So because the targeted brand name, in this case Cloudflare, is included in the domain name, brand monitoring solutions, MSPs should be able to pick this up, but there's still an opportunity here to sort of monitor that initial access infrastructure and see what we can build around it. So what are some of the things that we can do to sort of assess this infrastructure? Using DNS twists, we can say gather a list of those known bad domains that we've seen in the wild associated with Muddled Libra, and you sort of switch out the targeted brand name portion and swap that with our brand name. Then once you have like sort of a list of that, you can run them through DNS twists to get a bunch of permutations. And using that list, you have a couple options. You can bring those in to your portfolio via UDRP, or you can wait to see when they're going to actively, resolve to an IP address, which may indicate that the threat actor is sort of readying this infrastructure. Other options are to use vendor tools, tools like Silent Push and Domain Tools Iris, which they're not paying me to say, by the way. Um, they have features like regex and some built-in GUI functionality as well that'll allow you to scope and search for domains based off of a sort of set of criteria. If you wanted to look for domains that contain your targeted brand, a hyphen, and one of those octopus reusable key terms and a TLD, see what you get back from that search. Another thing is internet search engines come really handy here. So again, their credential harvesting pages are built in a way that, they're meant to mimic your organization's SSO. So if you know your SSO pages has, say, a website title of just login or SSO for organization name, you can use these internet search engines like Shodan to search for other infrastructure that has website titles containing SSO, login, access here, or VPN sign in here with the organization name and see what those web pages are. They may not be directly related to Muddled Libra, but they're probably still fishy and you want to bring those into the fold. Once you have all of that data, you can programmatically interact with these different sources and bring that data into a tip or a SIEM product as well. And again, here, this is where it makes sense to think about what works for your organization, whether this is a series of Python scripts or some PowerShell, however you can best achieve pulling in all that data and then sending it somewhere else for visualizations. Maybe you want to do some additional enrichment along the way, like scanning all of your results on URL scan for historical analysis and reference. But pulling that data in and planning that out builds out a good Intellimation use case. You build out your known bad domains, you scope out the different tools you need access to, you think about this, play around with your test environment, and see what data you get back on a first search. Doing all of this manually for one analyst could easily take an hour or two. So again, Intellimation may not be a complete savior or solution for you for everything, but it can definitely save some of that time and build in some efficiencies in your work. So next, we're going to move on to discuss some other elements of our pyramid of pain points, which was threat communication and parsing reports for TTPs. So by threat communication, I mean taking information about a threat and relaying it in different formats based off of your stakeholder. Leadership, incident response, threat hunters, they all have similar questions about a threat, but they may ingest that information in very different ways. Leadership may just want a slide discussing who this adversary is, how do they operate, how are we postured against it. Whereas threat hunters want to understand the TTPs, they want to understand how do you detect this activity in logs, which is very similar to the useful information that Unit 42 provided in this slide, which I know if it's difficult to see, it's literally just a run through of TTPs used by Muddled Libra. So I think it can be a bit annoying to have to sort of parse reports and cut and paste and generate so much good intel. And then you have to sort of figure out different ways to get it to different stakeholders. Wouldn't it be pretty cool if we just built a visualization or a dashboard that had all this information that met the needs of different groups and found a way to do that instead of having to sort of tailor different types of intel for those parties? Let's look at a solution to at least partially address that. So in this case, to get more information about an adversary, we're going to use published reporting that's already out there from vendors or even some victims may be really good about putting up a blog about what they saw the adversary do on their network. So manually, we would have to read all of this reporting and contextualize it to MITRE ATT&CK, do a lot of note taking. That can also, again, take up a lot of time depending on how many reports you're going through. In a quasi, I guess, automated fashion, we can use TRAM, which is a great project that has pre-trained large language models to help parse some of that information from reports and map it to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. TRAM stands for Threat Report Attack Mapper, I believe. You can find out more information on the Center for Threat Informed Defense's GitHub. So once you have this TTPs, like, great, you can take those and just give them to hunting or pen testing or other blue and purple team groups. But you can also push that a little bit further and expand it a little bit, enrich it. Once you have those TTPs, if you have MITRE ATT&CK mappings for your network controls or any endpoint controls and MITRE ATT&CK mappings for any custom detections you're running, These are Sigma rules, Yara rules, maybe custom Splunk logic you have. Combine those two and then compare that against the output from TRAM, and then you get some tradecraft gaps. Using that information, you can use that to prioritize new threat hunting efforts, future intelligence collection, and maybe even red teaming. For a threat like Muddled Libra that's so social engineering focused, it's really important to also use that information to prioritize security awareness testing opportunities as well. And pushing that information to a tip or a SIEM product, you can then compare the TTPs and the tradecraft there with your stock cases and internal alerts. And if those sources are curated in a way that has that data easily outlined, in doing so will allow you to generate new tactical intel for your technical teams and also new insights for leadership. You'll be able to use this in a way to monitor how the adversary has changed their tradecraft over time, and also how your detection coverage for this adversary has changed over time. With a big caveat that this will only cover known TTPs for an adversary. If they were to switch things up, then you have to incorporate some other things in that matter. So in the interest of time, we won't go too deep into strategic intel. I do think this is probably the area that's hardest to automate. But using the output from the tactical intellimation and the operational intellimation examples, you could have the sort of rough outline for a potential report to build. And again, if you let these things run for over a month or maybe even over a quarter, you can get some broader insight for how the adversary is changing in the wild and how your detection posture is changing as well. And use this to highlight areas of opportunity within your organization. So we're going to move on in a second to address some drawbacks and some things to consider. Please know that most of these things I consider as like pre-existing things in cybersecurity operations. So by adding automation to your CTI program, you're not adding more fuel to the fire. Shout out to Billy Joel. So automation cannot address every CTI pain point. We sort of hit on this already when talking about producing finished intel. It can be really discouraging if you say successfully automate a workflow or a process. You want to take this and apply it to other things. Well, first, if you do that, give yourself a pat on the back. You deserve it. But just know that eventually you may end up with a square peg in a round hole situation. So some things just strictly cannot be automated. You still may need eyes on glass, hands on keyboard, whatever the case may be. But it's really good to think about that up front so that you don't get too far in your process just to realize like you've come too far, you've put in all this time, and this really can't be achieved. So I think having that structure in place to consider up front with that planning, what are the guardrails, what are the outcomes of this solution, will really help sort of fix that so you're not too far in the game and having to go all the way back or untangle yourself. Also know that automated solutions may not work all of the time. And this is with regards to availability and accuracy. So if you're using third-party vendor tools or APIs, anything that impacts those tools will affect your work downstream. So just keep that in mind as well. And with regards to accuracy, again, just thinking back to our Muddled Libra tactical intellimation example, if the threat actor were to change how they stand up initial access infrastructure, then our whole example is going to need some major overhaul. So just keep in mind that whatever solution you build is only really for this point in time, and that you will have to go back and think about defining those measures and making sure that your solution falls within your accepted parameters. Having a minimum viable product here is really useful for that, because then you can measure whether or not your solution is meeting the needs that you defined, or if it's exceeding that, which would be awesome, or if it's falling just short. And if so, you just have to document changes, document why you need to make the changes, and then go ahead and push those as well. And lastly, and most importantly, every CTI analyst may not have a software developer background or skill set. They may not want to develop that skill set. And I think that's just okay. As we've heard here earlier today, cybersecurity, the face of cybersecurity has changed. I think diversity should be top of mind for all cybersecurity leaders and teams. This includes where we come from, what we look like, the languages we speak, but there's also this element of knowing that everyone on your team is unique in some way and can really contribute and bring some impact. So if those skills aren't natively on your team, I think there are other ways to bring that skill set in. If you have an intern program or a rotational employee program of sorts, consider seeking those skills that way. Look for someone with an automations background. Look for someone with that scripting background to help out. Another option is to do something you hear about on Capitol Hill a lot, which is to reach across the aisle. I'm sure there's someone in your organization that may have a DevOps background and may be tired of supporting that same boring project. Maybe they'll be willing to, of course, you work out with their manager, set aside an hour or two a month or a week to help contribute to your automation goals and make an impact to your team. The tricky part is normally figuring out what you're going to give them in return. But maybe there can be a targeted threat assessment, or maybe they're just happy to help them upskill in some cyber threat intelligence stuff. And before we close, let's think about some advancements in Intel and tech in general and how that can help shape Intellimation. So we've heard a lot about AI during our time here, and I'm was really excited and thankful for Thomas and Roberto's talk yesterday, because I think what they covered addresses so much of how AI can be used practically on cyber threat intelligence teams. So beyond the chat GPT craze and malware operators also getting in on the chat GPT craze, I think there are some really good use cases. One thing I've been looking into is, trying to configure a machine learning model to do threat actor scoring. Just a show of hands, like who has their own way of like doing threat actor scoring with like numerical weighting or anything like that? Okay, cool. We've got some hands. Yeah. I do want to give a shout out to, I believe his name's Christopher Martinkus. I saw him speak at Recorded Future Predict in the fall, and he had the sort of masterful spreadsheet doing threat actor scoring calculations. It was really impressive. But I think it would be cool, like taking a tool like the threat report summarization that we heard about from Thomas and Roberto that uses the few shot prompting to easily parse a report and give us the tools that were discussed, give us the maybe TTPs that were discussed, the industries that were targeted, and some indication of whether the activity was successful or not. Assign a numerical weighted scoring to each one of those criteria, and then feed that into a machine learning model and just have it tell us whether or not this is a threat actor we need to be concerned about. I think it's really important as researchers are coming up with new clusters of threat activity often. So it helps us stay ahead of the curve. And with that particular use case, it'd be really cool to do like some Intellimation chaining. So if a threat actor does fall within those parameters of a scored threat actor or a tracked threat, then you kick off your operational Intellimation use case and just start collecting TTPs and getting those tradecraft gaps. That would be really cool, I think, to bring in. For the language learning models, it's pretty interesting. Again, we heard some great stuff from Roberto's and Thomas's talk yesterday. But I know some other vendors out there are talking about using LLMs to sort of understand and analyze the syntax and the semantics around how threat actors actually engage and discuss on digital underground forums, and using that to sort of track their activity across social media. I think that'll be really cool for threats like Lazarus that operate heavily on LinkedIn. I think it'll be great from a disruption perspective, but then also paring that information down and using that as an actual indicator for cyber threat intelligence teams when they're filling out different dubious profiles out there. And lastly, and this is just more in general, I think AI will help sort of break that barrier for a lot of CTI teams. There won't be this need to have all of this good coding and scripting background, because AI with some things like prompt engineering will make that a little bit easier to quickly assess and ingest different types of data. So I think that'll just change like how threat intelligence engineering is currently defined. And I'm really excited to see how that turns out in the future. All right, so just to review what we've discussed today, adding automation to a CTI team can be a bit daunting, especially if you're operational and you have all these needs and everybody's always expecting something. You have all these stakeholders to engage and you're assisting with incident response. Uh, but having structure in place to review your output and the workflows you have, and being able to go back and figure out what are your areas of opportunity for automation can really help build that out. So first, again, with planning, you want to think about what your pain points are. Think about, is something actually, you know, can this be automated? What's the work that needs to go into this? Then go into identifying the tools and the people you need to make that happen. Document those and communicate those to your leadership. Then you want to develop your milestones for your solution. Think about what are the parameters you want to operate or have the solution operate in, and be able to continue to monitor those over time. Then once you have your test environment figured out, then you can focus on actually building out that solution. And again, that's going to be whatever makes sense for your environment. And then you're going to, whether it's something in GitHub, push that stuff to GitHub, set up your run books or playbooks in your tip or SOAR platform, or expose your Jupyter notebooks and continuously monitor that activity over time to make sure it's falling within your accepted parameters and that's performing the way you expect it to. And with that, that's all I had for y'all today. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope this was entertaining and informative, perhaps. But I look forward to hearing more about y'all Intellimation use cases. And thanks to Sans for having me as well.
Awesome. Fantastic presentation. And honestly, if you hadn't mentioned you were a first-time speaker, I think probably no one here would have noticed that. So great job and congratulations on your first SAN Summit talk.
Thank you.
All right, we've got a couple of questions. So you mentioned that not every CTI analyst needs to be an engineer and that there are ways around that. What if you're a CTI analyst who maybe a little bit does want to be an engineer? What would you recommend kind of starting? Are there other courses? Are there specific platforms? Or you mentioned Jupyter Notebooks, but where would you suggest they start?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. So I don't know if I'm gonna date myself with this, but back in the day, it was Code Academy was my favorite solution out there to learn more about different programming languages and have some different ways to interact with them and test building those out. But I think the one thing I would encourage is first expressing that to your management and making sure you're building that in whatever your yearly goals are to hold yourself accountable. But it's really, really tough to just have one particular place to go out and start. I think assigning yourself projects, little things at home, whether it's, okay, I want to learn Python, let me see maybe what vendor APIs I have access to at work, or free ones like iocparser.com is a pretty open tool. You can go out and sign up and just use their API to send in, pass in reports and analyze that data. So I think it's really on you to figure out one, what it is specifically you want to do, and then find a pathway to get that done. And make sure you're doing stuff outside of work too to just keep yourself accountable for it.
Awesome, thank you. And I will just mention recently, my son told me he went down a rabbit hole listening to old music from, 2017 to 2019. So I think we're in good company here around dating ourselves. So what recommendations can you offer to show leadership that an automation project is worth the effort?
Oh yeah. So I think with this, it depends on one, knowing your leadership. If they're very visual, then you have to build out a use case and sort of showcase that to them. And sometimes pair it down with emerging threat reporting, perhaps, and then sometimes fear. I hate to use fear as a motivator, but sometimes it's good occasionally. Um, for example, I know most Intel teams operate some data or may have access to some data that includes deep and dark web collection. So if you're able to showcase, for example, how you can automate collecting, say, exposed credentials for your organization, and then seeing that all the way through, passing that information to your SOC team. And most of the time, organizations have a very structured acceptance around certain passwords and things like that. So you may be able to automate some of those credential checks to say if this is an actual password, but building out that sort of use case and showing it in real time and then pairing it with something like a Verizon data breach report that may indicate, oh, 50% or whatever number of breaches occur as a result of exposed credentials, then you can use that to inform your leadership like, hey, here's a good use case I want to automate. And then this is why this is really important and really timely for our organization. I think just putting it into them, like showing it off as clear as day is probably the best way to do it.
Awesome. So you have a question from Sierra. So what has worked well for your team in terms of identifying an opportunity to develop the solution and then actually kicking off the project? I imagine there's a lot of ideas in the organization, but challenges to execution.
Yes, yes. So I think the troubles with kicking off the project, I mean, identifying is very easy, very, very easy. All you have to do is sort of like pass around a mic and ask people what parts of their daily workflows do they not like, and everyone's quick to say something really quickly. So then you have this laundry list of complaints, if you will, of how the organization is ran and the workflows and the things you're doing. Kicking off the project, the best way or the most effective ways I've seen that done is, again, once you have your leadership buy-in, having your leadership help you hold other teams accountable. That's probably the most efficient solution. I think having some understanding, whether it's tracked through Jira or a shared calendar or something like, here are our milestones, here are our cutoff dates, we're behind, we need input from this team, we need input from that team. I think to me, that's probably one of the best ways to do it. Thank you.
Awesome. Do we have any questions in the room? Oh, yep.
So I'm sure the answer is going to be depends in some way, but do you have any thoughts on for a team that's going to start, whether it's good to start at the bottom of the pyramid or find the most value add use case and try and dive in on that?
Yeah, I definitely think, I hate to say it depends, but yeah, I definitely think that's part of the answer. But it really depends on how familiar, like what resources you have on your team. So if you have a really small team and there's something that's blaring, that's crushing you from being able to free up time to work on other things, then that's probably where I would start, regardless of how difficult that may be to automate. There has to be some way around that. For larger teams that may have infinitely larger pyramid of different complexities, then I think it does make sense to start off from the bottom, especially if it's your first time kicking off a project where you may need resources from other people and from other tools you've never used before, just to play around and lay out that groundwork. So as you move up the pyramid and things become more complex, you have some understanding of like all these sort of things that you want to get out the way first, like the barriers for entry for different things and that type of stuff. You have an understanding of how that all works when you're working on the more complex items.
Awesome. So Scott Roberts has a question, and I'm not at all surprised to see this question come from Scott, wherever you are in the room. How do you see using tools like CyberChef to enable non-programmers to create automations? Is CyberChef a tool you use at all?
Yes, I absolutely love CyberChef. I mean, I don't know who hasn't used the URL encode or decode or the base64 encode or decode. I think it's because it's very visual, at least from the GUI perspective. It's very easy to at least introduce different topics and introduce different ways to become familiar with different things. So I absolutely love CyberChef and would encourage that, or adding that in a tool set for any automation project you're working on.
All right. Let's see. I think we have time for one more. I'm going to pick Adam's question, unless there's anyone else in the room. I mean, I know Adam's in the room, but I'm just going to ask your question for you. So you mentioned, I think you hit on this kind of in your last slide, but Adam wants to know how you look at precision and recall of AI and automation. You mentioned TRAM specifically, and Adam mentioned that they found low percentages for both of those. So how do you kind of assess and decide when a tool is going to be good in an automation for your specific use case?
Yeah, so I think, this is again one of those areas where it's like, if you start with some of those low threshold items or the things that are lower on your pyramid of pain points, you can explore and play around for a little bit. You have to sort of include that in, and like that sort of just evaluation and play around period for a while. I don't think there's, or at least I don't have a particular solution or like parameters around when this is, good enough or efficient enough for me to use. I think it's just about like my familiarity with it. And if I can explain what's going on behind the scenes, if you will, then that adds a little bit more brevity for me into like why I feel confident or good about a particular tool. But if I get the sense that it's not well supported, it's not well documented, especially if it's a third-party tool, then I'm abandoning ship and not touching it at all.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we all hopefully took something away that we can use.
Awesome.